Honeyman, The Origin of Evil in Virginia. Based on real stories. The accident. The storm raged across rural Virginia that October night in 1904, turning dirt roads into rivers of mud and painting the sky with lightning that seemed to tear the very fabric of reality. The prison bus trudged along, its headlights barely penetrating the curtain of rain that fell, as if the sky was trying to wash some ancient sin from the face of the earth. Inside the vehicle, 12 highly dangerous inmates were handcuffed, escorted by 4 armed guards towards the Clifton State Penitentiary. The air smelled of sweat, fear, and something else. Something only the rookie guard sitting near the back could hear emanating from the prisoner in the last seat. Douglas Grifon was not like the other inmates. While some blasphemed, others prayed and most simply stared into space with eyes empty of hope. Grifon remained as still as a statue, his shackles immaculately positioned on his lap. Her thinness was almost unearthly, her skin so pale that pulsing blue veins were visible beneath the surface like little rivers of life running through a white desert. But it was his eyes that really unsettled anyone who dared to look at them for more than a few seconds. Blue like deep ice, eternally open, never blinking, as if afraid of losing something crucial if they closed even for an instant. "That one isn't normal," muttered the oldest guard, Jenkins, lowering his voice as he passed Grifon's seat during a patrol. They found strange symbols drawn on the walls of his cell, in blood. Blood that wasn't his. The rookie swallowed hard, avoiding looking back. Jenkins continued. The bodies of his victims were never found, only the skins hanging like clothes drying in the sun, covered with those same symbols. A particularly violent flash of lightning illuminated the interior of the vehicle for an instant, transforming Grifon's silhouette into a spectral, almost two-dimensional figure against the fogged window. At that exact moment, as if orchestrated by some conscious force, the bus's wheels lost grip on the curve. The driver cursed, turning the steering wheel frantically as the vehicle skidded off the road, sliding down the muddy slope before tipping violently onto its right side, and finally coming to a stop, half submerged in a stream that the rain had turned into a torrent. The next few seconds were pure chaos. Glass shattered, men screamed, metal twisted. The impact had damaged part of the handcuffs and security systems. The rookie guard, dazed and with blood pouring from a cut on his forehead, watched as the inmate from Bank 7, a burly man convicted of first-degree murder, managed to free one of his hands, and in one swift motion, ripped the gun from Jenkins's holster. The first shot went upwards, piercing the already damaged ceiling. The second hit the fuel tank. The fire spread with terrifying speed, licking the metal walls of the bus, consuming seats and uniforms, turning the already heavy air into toxic smoke. Amid screams of despair and the crackling of flames, few noticed when Douglas Grifon, somehow freed from his shackles without any sign of struggle, slipped silently through the broken window like a shadow fleeing the light. His feet touched the mud without making a sound, his eyes never blinking even with the rain lashing his face. For a moment, he stood there, watching the hell the bus had turned into, the screams of the men burning alive forming a macabre symphony with the roar of the storm. His thin lips curved into an almost imperceptible smile when his eyes caught, in the distance, between flashes of lightning, the solid silhouette of a bridge recently built over the valley. Something inside him resonated, as if he recognized that structure, as if he had been waiting for it all his life. Finally, he whispered to himself, his voice lost in the howling wind, the perfect place to start. For 3 days and 3 nights, Douglas Grifon wandered through the sodden forest, his bare feet leaving marks that the persistent rain soon erased, as if nature itself conspired to hide his passage. His thin body, already weakened by years of confinement, was on the verge of collapse, sustained only by a supernatural willpower and by something deeper, a compulsion that guided him inexorably towards that bridge he had glimpsed on the night of the accident. Without food, drinking only water from puddles and chewing bark, Grifon moved like a specter among the ancient oaks, muttering words in a language no linguist would recognize, his ice-blue eyes fixed on the horizon, never blinking even as branches lashed his face, leaving thin cuts that barely bled on his unnaturally pale skin. At dawn on the fourth day, a flash in the still stormy sky illuminated their destination. The bridge stood majestically over a gorge, its newly laid concrete foundations contrasting with the pristine landscape around it. Massive columns supported the structure, creating protected spaces between them, perfect for a fugitive. Grifon crawled under the bridge, his fingers scratching the concrete as if testing the texture of a new lover. "You were waiting for me," he whispered, pressing his face against the cold surface, feeling vibrations impossible to detect by ordinary human senses. "You were built for me." Hunger consumed him like fire, burning his insides, and his body shook uncontrollably as he finally collapsed onto the damp ground, closing his eyes for the first time in days. His dreams were peopled by strange symbols pulsing like living hearts, and by a voice that sounded like thousands speaking in unison. "Feed us. Complete the cycle. Open the way." When he woke up hours later, the faint light of a sun hidden by heavy clouds filtered through the gaps in the bridge. It was then that he saw his first sign, his first gift, a small brown wild rabbit, sniffing cautiously just a few meters away. Grifon's movement was so fast that it seemed impossible for his weakened body. His bony fingers gripped the animal with deadly precision, wrapping around the small furry body that instantly twitched in panic. The rabbit's powerful hind legs swung frantically, leaving deep cuts on the man's arms, but he did not loosen his grip. His eyes, fixed on those of the terrified animal, seemed to consume the fear emanating from the creature. When the rabbit finally stopped struggling, suffocated by the relentless fingers, something extraordinary happened. An intense heat ran through Grifon's body, starting from the fingertips that touched the animal and spreading like liquid fire through his veins. For a fleeting moment he could feel the rabbit's heart still beating, transferring not just its last breath of life, but something else, something ancient and powerful. "I understand now," muttered Grifon, his eyes taking on an unearthly glow as he examined the small corpse. "You are the messengers, the intermediaries." Instead of satisfying his hunger by devouring the animal, he took from his pocket a piece of wire found in the rubble of the bridge's construction. With fingers that seemed to have known this ritual for millennia, he hung the dead rabbit from one of the support beams, positioning it meticulously until the body was swaying gently in the damp breeze. "The first sacrifice," he declared with the solemnity of an ancient priest. "The first step." Over the next few days, as the storm finally gave way to oppressive gray skies, Grifon settled into a disturbing routine. During the day, he remained hidden under the bridge, often motionless for hours, his eyes fixed on the symbols he had begun to scratch into the concrete using sharp rocks and later fragments of rabbit bones. At night he hunted with increasing efficiency, stronger and stronger, faster and faster, as if each sacrifice gave him back something he had lost long ago. The hanging rabbits multiplied, forming a morbid mobile that swayed with the night breeze, glassy eyes fixed eternally on the void. Most unsettling, however, was the visible change in the bridge itself. Where Grifon scratched his strange symbols, the concrete seemed to respond. Tiny cracks appeared, not from decay but precisely, following the lines of the symbols, like dark veins pulsing faintly in certain lights. On particularly dark nights, if one looked closely, one could swear that these veins pulsed in sync with the heartbeat of the pale man, who now barely resembled the escaped prisoner. Grifon's skin had become almost translucent, revealing a network of darkened veins. His eyes, once an icy blue, now glowed with an unearthly luminescence, especially at night, and his body, although still thin, moved with a predatory agility that defied his apparent fragility. It was on one of these hunting nights, when the new moon made the darkness almost absolute, that Grifon found something different. A man. A middle-aged street vendor had chosen to camp near the bridge, attracted by the structure's protection from the heavy dew. From his hiding place in the shadows, Grifon watched with almost childlike fascination as the man prepared a small fire, organized his wares, and finally settled down for the night. He noticed how the vendor looked nervously at the hanging rabbit carcasses, visible in the flickering light of the fire, how he tried to ignore them, convincing himself that they were just some kind of territorial mark from local hunters. "He feels," whispered Grifon into the darkness. "But he does not understand. He feels the power growing here." When the salesman finally fell restlessly asleep, his dreams populated by images of dead eyes watching him, Grifon emerged from the shadows. With the silent grace of a natural predator, in his hand, a sharp piece of metal found in the construction debris glowed with a luster that didn't just come from the faint reflection of the embers. The next morning, the little fire was cold. The abandoned wares were beginning to become damp with dew, and beneath the bridge, a new offering hung among the rabbits, bigger, more complex, infinitely more powerful. In the days that followed, curiously, no one in the region missed the street vendor who used to travel those roads. It was as if he had never existed, except as a fleeting dream quickly forgotten upon awakening. Such was the power that began to emanate from that ordinary bridge, that it slowly transformed into something much more sinister, a portal between worlds sealed with symbols written in blood. The Clifton Herald on November 17, 1904. Its front page featured a headline that immediately captured the attention of local residents. "Nurse disappears on way to home service." The article detailed how 26-year-old Mary Sullivan had set out on her bicycle to visit an elderly patient on the Campbell estate, but had never reached her destination. A preliminary search had found only his bicycle abandoned near the new railway bridge, with no signs of struggle or violence. What the newspaper did not mention, considered too macabre a detail for publication, was that officers had also found 3 rabbit carcasses hanging from a nearby tree, their rigid bodies swaying in the breeze like morbid pendants. 2 weeks later, the same newspaper carried another distressing headline: "Couple disappears after car breaks down on rural road." Jonathan and Elizabeth Parker had gone out to dinner in a neighboring town and never returned home. His carriage was found with a broken wheel approximately half a mile from the bridge, the horse still harnessed, nervous and uninjured. Again, no sign of violence, no concrete clues, just the inexplicable void left by 2 lives that simply faded into the autumn night. And again, the unpublished detail: 5 dead rabbits found arranged in a circular pattern around the carriage, their small bodies mutilated with markings that officials described as strange symbols, possibly some kind of language or code. At Sheriff Martin Thornwood's office, a map of the area covered the main wall, little red pins marking each disappearance. 7 in less than a month, all within a 2-mile radius of the new railway bridge. Thornwood was not a superstitious man. His 20 years of service had taught him that behind every mystery, there was always a rational explanation, usually involving human evil rather than supernatural forces. Tall, broad-shouldered, with a graying mustache that gave him an air of unshakable authority, the sheriff studied the emerging pattern with the shrewd eyes of a predator. "It's him, isn't it?" asked his deputy Jeffries, a younger man more likely to believe the stories now circulating in local bars. "That prisoner who escaped the accident, Grifon." "7 people don't just disappear," Thornwood replied, tracing an imaginary line between the pins with his calloused finger. "And 7 people are not easily hidden, not even by a man like Douglas Grifon." The sheriff took a worn folder from his desk, the file transferred from the state prison after the accident. Portraits of Grifon stared back at him from the yellowing pages, those disturbing eyes that seemed to follow the viewer even through a black and white photograph. But these dead rabbits are his signature. The arrest report mentions rituals with small animals before the murders he was convicted of. Sheriff did not share with his deputy the feeling of growing uneasiness that consumed him each time he read Grifon's file. How did a weak, malnourished, and unarmed convict manage to capture people? Some of them, like the Parker couple, physically capable of defending themselves. Why did none of the victims scream, struggle, or show any sign of resistance? And even, more disturbing, why had no bodies been found? Grifon's previous victims before his arrest had been discovered, or at least parts of them, arranged in ritual patterns that researchers at the time described as the works of an intellect totally disconnected from human sanity. The town of Clifton, once a quiet community where many didn't even lock their doors at night, had been transformed in just a few days. Windows now remained closed even during the midday heat. Children no longer played unattended in backyards. Groups of armed men voluntarily patrolled the neighborhoods at dusk. At Sunday services, Reverend Calloway interspersed his sermons with warnings about the evil that walks among us and the need to purify our community. In schools, teachers noticed the increasing absence of students, kept at home by fearful parents. In bars, increasingly elaborate theories circulated. Grifon possessed hypnotic powers. Grifon had made a pact with the devil. Grifon was not even human, but some kind of evil spirit that took human form. What no one knew, what no one could imagine, was that under the bridge, in his increasingly elaborate sanctuary, Douglas Grifon no longer looked anything like the man he once was. His body, although still thin, now possessed supernatural strength, capable of easily subduing men much larger than himself. His skin had become so translucent that in certain light it revealed not just darkened veins, but complex patterns formed by them, as if his circulatory system were being remodeled by an alien intelligence. His eyes emitted a bluish glow that was noticeable even in complete darkness, and remained open, even during the rare moments when his body required rest. But the most profound transformation was internal. Grifon's mind had expanded in ways incomprehensible to the average human intellect. Voices, dozens, hundreds of them, constantly whispered in his ears, bringing knowledge from dimensions beyond mortal comprehension. In trance states, which became increasingly frequent, he glimpsed his patron, a colossal entity that existed between the layers of reality, with a shape vaguely reminiscent of a grotesquely distorted rabbit, whose eyes contained the void between the stars. "More sacrifices," the voices whispered in unison. "More symbols, complete the pattern, open the portal," and Grifon obeyed with the devotion of an apostle. inscribing increasingly complex symbols on the skin of his victims before hanging them with the rabbits beneath the bridge, which now looked more like a bloody altar than a humanly engineered structure. The dark veins that had begun as small cracks in the concrete now pulsed visibly, following exactly the lines of the arcane symbols, as if the bridge itself was slowly transforming into a living organism, or something far worse, a portal between dimensions fueled by blood and terror. The full moon hung over the Virginia landscape like a watchful eye, bathing the railroad bridge in a silvery light that revealed every crack, every imperfection in its concrete structure. But that night, those cracks felt different. They pulsed, subtly, with a darkness deeper than the absence of light, like veins carrying a fluid that wasn't blood. Sheriff Thornwood felt a chill run down his spine as he led his 6 deputies down the muddy trail, each man armed to the teeth and yet uneasy, as if their weapons were children's toys at what awaited them. The air was unnaturally still. No breeze, no sounds of insects or nocturnal animals, just the oppressive silence and the occasional crunch of officers' boots on dry leaves. "Spread out into siege formation," ordered Thornwood in a low voice as they approached the structure. "Washington and Miller, cover the east side. Jeffries and Peterson the west. Brooks and Davis keep an eye on the creek area in case he tries to escape that way." The men nodded nervously, moving apart with their flashlights, creating flickering beams of light that cut through the darkness. Thornwood advanced alone through the center, his revolver firmly gripped, his watchful eyes scanning every shadow. It was then that he saw him, a figure sitting calmly on top of the bridge, his tattered clothes swaying gently in a breeze that no one else seemed to feel. "I am here." Douglas Grifon's voice cut through the silence like a blade, melodious and ethereal, echoing impossibly as if it came simultaneously from all directions. "You arrived just in time to witness the conclusion." Their eyes glowed in the darkness with their own light, small electric blue headlights watching the officers with an almost childlike curiosity, like a scientist observing insects under a magnifying glass. His appearance could barely be called human now, skin so translucent that moonlight seemed to pass through it, revealing the map of dark veins that formed complex patterns beneath the surface. The abnormally long and articulated fingers like those of a spider. The serene smile completely devoid of the slightest spark of sanity. "Douglas Grifon," the sheriff's voice boomed, authoritative, trying to mask the fear that was growing in his chest at the sight. "You're surrounded. Get down immediately with your hands where we can see them." The deputies converged, creating a perimeter of guns aimed at the man perched above them. "You are under arrest for the murders of Mary Sullivan, Jonathan and Elizabeth Parker, and every other citizen of this community. There is no way out this time." Grifon tilted his head slightly, as if listening to distant music, a serene smile playing on his thin, pale lips. "Murders?" he repeated, his voice as smooth as silk tearing through skin. "No, Sheriff, sacrifices, transformations. They didn't die. They became part of something bigger, something eternal." He extended his arms to the sides in a theatrical gesture that encompassed the entire bridge. "Can't you see, can't you feel? This place is no longer just concrete and metal. It's a womb, a chrysalis, a portal between worlds." A chill that had nothing to do with the night's temperature ran down the sheriff's spine. Something about Grifon's tone, the absolute conviction with which he spoke these crazy things, made the words seem not just delusions, but truths too terrible for the human mind to properly process. "Enough talking, Grifon," Thornwood ordered, trying to regain control of the situation. "This is your last chance. Get down now or we'll shoot." "You don't understand," replied Grifon, now standing on the edge of the bridge, his thin body silhouetted against the moon like a dead tree against the winter sky. "I'm not resisting. My role here is done." The deputies nervously adjusted their aim fingers tense against the triggers, waiting for the sheriff's order. Below Grifon, the newly laid train tracks glistened like liquid silver in the moonlight. "The portal is almost open," he continued, his voice taking on a reverent tone. "The ritual is complete. He will come now." On the distant horizon, a point of light began to grow, the headlamp of a night freight train approaching inexorably. The long, melancholy whistle cut the air, like the lament of a soul aware of its role in an inescapable destiny. The sheriff realized too late what was about to happen. "Grifon, don't do that!" he shouted, running to the base of the bridge. "We can help you. Whatever you think you're doing, there's still time to stop." Grifon turned to face them one last time, and what the officers saw in his face none of them would ever forget. It was not the look of a madman, nor of a despairer, but of a devotee in the moment of his supreme revelation, of a martyr embracing his destiny with transcendental joy. His eyes, now completely taken over by that unearthly blue glow, seemed to contain entire universes. "Too late," he whispered, his voice somehow audible even over the approaching roar of the train. "The ritual has begun." With those words, he jumped, not in desperation or to flee, but with deliberate purpose, with calculated precision and perfect timing to meet the speeding locomotive. The impact was instantaneous and devastating. Grifon's body was thrown dozens of meters like a rag doll, torn apart by the train's relentless power, his blood splattering the tracks and surrounding concrete like crimson rain in the moonlight. The driver, realizing too late what had happened, applied the brakes in a panic, but the huge machine was only able to stop well beyond the point of impact. Sheriff Thornwood was the first to reach Douglas Grifon's remains, his flashlight revealing a spectacle that defied comprehension. Despite the devastating impact, which should have reduced any human body to an unrecognizable mass, Grifon's face remained almost intact, as if protected by some invisible force. And worse, much worse, was the expression engraved on him, not of pain or fear or surprise, but of absolute ecstasy, of serene triumph, as if his death were not an end, but a long-awaited apotheosis. "My God," Jeffries whispered, coming to the sheriff's side. What happened to him?" The question referred not to the obvious impact, but to what the light from their flashlights revealed on Grifon's exposed skin, where his clothes had been ripped off by the impact. His entire torso, arms, and what remained of his legs were covered in symbols meticulously cut into the flesh itself, not fresh injuries caused by the accident, but deliberately carved scars, clearly made days before. Impossible hieroglyphics, curves and angles that seemed to violate the laws of geometry, patterns that made your eyes hurt, trying to follow them, as if you were observing something that existed simultaneously in more dimensions than the human brain was designed to process. "He did this to himself," Thornwood muttered, his mind struggling to process what he saw. But how? Would he reach his own back? At that moment, as if answering his unspoken question about what had really happened to the missing victims, a sudden clap of thunder shook the previously clear sky. A drop of rain hit the sheriff's forehead, followed by another and another. But it wasn't water falling from the sky. It was a dark, viscous liquid with the consistency of oil, which left smoking marks wherever it touched the ground. And for a moment, just a fleeting glimpse as he looked up. Thornwood could have sworn he saw, silhouetted against the moon now partially obscured by clouds that hadn't been there minutes before, the monstrous silhouette of something that vaguely resembled a rabbit, if rabbits were the size of mountains and had eyes that contained the darkness between the stars. The Thornwood Sheriff's Office had transformed over the months following Douglas Grifon's death. What was once an organized and functional space now resembled the lair of an obsessed detective or a crazed scholar. The walls, previously decorated only with official maps and wanted notices, were now covered with meticulous reproductions of the symbols found on Grifon's body, photographs of the crash site, newspaper clippings about the disappearances, and a complex network of red threads connecting seemingly disparate elements. The sheriff's desk had disappeared beneath stacks of books on the occult, ancient linguistics, comparative religion, and folklore, many of them borrowed from university libraries as far away as Baltimore and Washington. In one corner, a locked trunk contained the most disturbing items, samples of the strange liquid that had fallen from the sky that fateful night, which inexplicably refused to evaporate or deteriorate. Fragments of concrete from the bridge showing the strange dark veins and photographs of Grifon's mutilated body that were too graphic to be included in the official report. Dr. Ellsworth says he's never seen anything like it, murmured Thornwood to Jeffries, his deputy and now only confidant, as he examined the most recent rejection letter. For months, the sheriff had sent copies of the symbols to experts across the country, anthropologists, linguists, historians, even military cryptographers. The answers were always variations on the same theme. The symbols did not correspond to any known writing system, language, or code. They were not Egyptian hieroglyphics or Sumerian cuneiform. They were not Norse runes or Eastern ideograms. They were not even similar to any system of magical notation documented by occult scholars. Professor Harrington of Princeton suggests they may be a completely invented language, a kind of personal code, the sheriff continued, his voice betraying deep exhaustion. But that doesn't explain why so many experts report discomfort when studying them, or why 3 of them had panic attacks while analyzing them. What Thornwood didn't confess, not even to Jeffries, were his own nightmares. Nights when he woke up in a cold sweat, with fragmented visions of the symbols dancing behind his eyelids, forming patterns that almost made terrible sense before dissolving into waking oblivion. Nights when I dreamed of the bridge, not as it was now, abandoned and avoided by all the locals, but as something alive, pulsating, a womb gestating some impossible monstrosity, and recurring dreams of a gigantic rabbit whose eyes held the void between the stars, watching him patiently, awaiting something that the sheriff refused to understand, even in his dreamlike delirium. The question that continues to haunt me, Thornwood said as he walked over to the map on the wall, is why none of the victims' bodies have been found. Not a drop of blood, not a strand of hair. His finger traced the outline of the bridge on the map, and then a wider circle around it. The searches were exhaustive. We brought in sniffer dogs from 3 counties, and yet 7 people just evaporated. He turned to face his deputy, eyes bloodshot from nights without adequate sleep. Unless we're not looking for physical bodies anymore. Unless what Grifon said about transformations was literally true. Jeffries looked away, clearly uncomfortable with the direction the conversation was taking. It wasn't the first time the sheriff had suggested explanations that went beyond the rational, beyond what was acceptable to a lawman. "Sir," he said cautiously, Perhaps it's time to move on. The case is officially closed. Grifon is dead. The disappearances have stopped. The community is beginning to recover. It was true. In the 6 months since Grifon's death, life in Clifton had slowly returned to normality. Doors were once again unlocked at night. Children were playing unattended again, and voluntary patrols had been discontinued. The bridge, however, remained a taboo place, avoided by everyone. The railway company, after a series of unexplained accidents with the trains that crossed it, mechanical failures, sudden deaths of animals they were transporting, passengers reporting disturbing hallucinations, had finally decided to reroute the route, leaving the structure as an abandoned monument to the failure of human engineering. Or something worse. Stories about what happened that full moon night quickly turned into urban legend. In local taverns, Grifon began calling Bunny Man due to his strange fixation with animals, and rumors that, in the weeks before his capture, some villagers had spotted a skeletal figure wearing what appeared to be a rabbit's head, silently watching from the shadows of the forest. "I can't just forget," replied Thornwood finally, his voice low but firm. "Not after what I saw. Not after that thing in the sky." He took a leather-bound journal from a locked drawer, opening it where a ribbon marked a specific page. "I've been following the changes in the bridge since that night. The dark veins are growing. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, but they are. And there's something else. Something I noticed only recently." He pushed the journal toward Jeffries, pointing to a series of meticulous notes of dates and observations. "Every 33 days there's a more significant change, a stronger pulse, as if something is breathing on a regular cycle." Jeffries looked through the notes with increasing discomfort. It was true. There was a clear pattern marked by the sheriff's precise handwriting. Every 33 days the veins not only grew larger, but seemed to momentarily come to life, pulsing with a more intense darkness that seemed to absorb the surrounding light. "That doesn't prove anything," he said finally, handing the diary back. "It could be anything, changes in temperature, weather, atmospheric pressure affecting the damaged concrete." "What if the cycle is longer?" asked Thornwood, more to himself than to his deputy, his eyes fixed on a distant point beyond the office walls. "If 33 days marks a lower pulse, what would 33 months bring? Or 33 years?" He ran his fingers through his hair, now significantly grayer than it had been 6 months ago. The symbols on Grifon's body, some of them were repeated in specific sequences. The number 33 appeared consistently, in different configurations. The sheriff stood up abruptly, going over to the map and tracing the outline of the bridge again, this time with almost feverish energy. What if Grifon wasn't the end? What if he was just the beginning? A catalyst for something greater, something that operates on a timescale we can barely comprehend. His eyes met Jeffries's, and there was something in them that the deputy had never seen before. Not just fear or obsession, but a terrible, profound understanding, like that of a man who had glimpsed a truth so vast and incomprehensible that his mind could only process fragments of it without shattering. We need to monitor this place, not just for months, but for years, decades if necessary. Because something tells me that what Grifon started that night didn't end with his death. In fact, I'm increasingly certain that his death was precisely the point. That same night, after Jeffries left and the sheriff's office was plunged into darkness, Thornwood made one last entry in his journal, the shaky words betraying his mental state. "The dreams are getting worse. Now I see beyond the bridge. I see an endless cycle, a portal that opens and closes in periods of 33. years, decades, and with each cycle it becomes stronger, more present. The being behind the rabbit. It's not a rabbit. It just wears that way we wear clothes. His true form is beyond our understanding. And he is hungry, always hungry. He feeds on fear, on terror, and Grifon was only his herald, his first priest in this world. There will be others when the symbols are complete, when the cycle reaches its peak. Clifton Herald, November 17, 1937, small article. Page 12. Rabbit carcasses found near old railway bridge. Authorities attribute it to juvenile vandalism. This short article, easily ignored by most readers, would have aroused great alarm in Martin. Thornwood, if the old sheriff had still been alive to read it. But Thornwood had died 3 years earlier, taking his obsession with Douglas Grifon to his grave, and leaving behind only a locked trunk containing his diaries, photographs, and notes about the case. A trunk that his son, horrified by the apparent madness that had consumed his father in his final years, had relegated to the attic of the family home, where it would remain forgotten for decades. The first true manifestation of what would later be known as the Bunnyman cycle occurred on the night of December 12, 1937, exactly 33 years after Douglas Grifon's death. Robert and Eleanor Maitland were returning from a dance in a neighboring town, their car gliding along the dark road that passed near the old abandoned bridge. It was almost midnight when the vehicle's headlights illuminated a tall, skeletal figure standing in the middle of the road. "I will never forget that vision," Eleanor would later tell police, her voice shaking with the terror of the memory. "It was a man, I'm sure, but there was something wrong with its head. It seemed to have long ears, like a rabbit, and its eyes glowed like blue lanterns in the dark." Before Robert could fully break, the figure raised what appeared to be an axe, striking the windshield with devastating force, shattering the glass and nearly decapitating Robert, who escaped by inches as he threw himself to the side. The attack lasted just seconds. The creature disappeared into the darkness of the adjacent forest, leaving behind only the damaged car and a shell-shocked couple. The incident was officially recorded as an attempted robbery, probably perpetrated by a vagrant or fugitive. What the official reports omitted, deliberately as internal sheriff's office memos would later reveal, were the most disturbing details. The fact that, over the next 33 days, 6 other people reported similar encounters, all near the bridge. The unexplained disappearance of a local hunter who had set up camp in the area. And, most significantly, the complex symbols found carved into trees around the bridge, identical to those documented on Grifon's body decades earlier. The sheriff's office, determined to avoid public panic and fearful of the impact that such revelations would have on the community's reputation, instituted a secrecy protocol that would be maintained and expanded with each new manifestation of the cycle. In January 1938, as abruptly as they had begun, the incident stopped. The bridge returned to its state of silent abandonment, the black veins in its concrete pulsing imperceptibly, waiting. Sensitive people passing through the area occasionally reported unsettling sensations, the impression of being watched, inaudible whispers at the edge of perception, disturbing dreams that remained vivid for days, but nothing that could be officially documented or warranted investigation. The community, as often happens, chose to forget, relegating the Bunny Man to the status of local urban legend, a story to scare teenagers on camping trips. 33 years later, in December 1970, rabbit carcasses began to appear again, hanging from trees near the bridge. This time, however, the discovery coincided with urban development expanding across the Virginia region. a new generation, occupied positions of authority with no personal memory of the events of 1937, and the sheriff's office's restrictive memorandum had been filed away and forgotten. The new police chief, Thomas Hayes, initially treated the dead rabbits as a typical case of animal cruelty, possibly perpetrated by teenagers. That changed drastically on December 26th, when a group of 5 teenagers on a courageous expedition to explore the abandoned bridge completely disappeared. The search operation was massive, involving police, volunteers, sniffer dogs, and even helicopters. After 4 days of non-stop searching, only one of the teenagers was found. David Collins, 16, curled up in the fetal position inside the hollow trunk of a tree kilometers from the bridge, his body covered in self-inflicted scratches, in a profound catatonic state. When he was finally able to speak, after weeks of intensive therapy, his words were recorded by psychiatrist Dr. Lawrence Kellman. He has no face beneath the rabbit mask, just a black hole like the space between the stars. And he wanted us to become like him. He began to cut symbols into their skin, and the symbols moved as if they were alive, oozing like ink, but it wasn't ink, it was something. Darker than darkness. The others, they began to change. Their skin became transparent, and they began to hang from upside down, like rabbits. Collins's testimony was immediately classified as confidential by the Clifton Police Department, and the young man was officially diagnosed with traumatic psychosis induced by prolonged experience in the woods during adverse weather conditions. Chief Hayes, however, disturbed by the similarities to historical incidents, decided to investigate further. It was then that he discovered former Sheriff Thornwood's trunk, now in the possession of his grandson, who had rediscovered it during spring cleaning. The revelations contained in the diaries and notes led Hayes to implement a bridge surveillance protocol that would last the full 33 days of the cycle, during which 3 more people went missing nearby, and multiple sightings of the rabbit-headed man were recorded, some by experienced police officers on patrol. Following the established pattern, the incidents completely stopped after the 33rd day. The case of the missing teenagers remained officially open, but active investigations were gradually abandoned. Chief Hayes, however, established a permanent protocol. Every 33 years, a special task force would be assembled to monitor the bridge and its surroundings during the critical 33-day period, each time beginning on December 12th. The official report justifying this procedure vaguely cited historical patterns of cyclical criminal activity, without going into detail about the true nature of the threat. Hayes also established a secret archive, accessible only to the chief of police and a select number of senior officers, containing all records relating to the Bunnyman phenomenon, including Thornwood's original diaries. In 2003, the cycle returned with relentless precision. This time, however, technology had advanced significantly. Security cameras have been discreetly installed at several points around the bridge, now part of a small, rarely visited historic park. On the night of December 17th, one of these cameras captured images that defy rational explanation. An unnaturally tall and thin humanoid figure moving with unnatural fluidity among the trees, its head adorned with what appeared to be long, pointed ears jutting upward. Even more disturbing was the quality of the image. While the surrounding forest appeared clearly, the figure itself seemed to absorb the light, creating a black silhouette darker than the night itself, with the exception of 2 bright spots where the eyes should have been. The monitoring team, led by Detective Richard Moore, followed protocol established decades earlier. Immediate isolation of the area, 24-hour armed patrols, and strict confidentiality. Even so, 5 people went missing during that cycle, including one of the patrol officers, Sergeant James Wilson, 42, a 15-year veteran of the police force. His radio emitted just one abruptly cut-off scream before going silent forever. His body was never found, only his badge, discovered hanging from a tree along with a freshly butchered rabbit carcass. The most disturbing element of this cycle, documented in detail in the task force's confidential report, was the condition of the bridge itself. The black veins described in Thornwood's original journals and monitored in subsequent cycles had not only grown, but begun to expand beyond the concrete structure. Black roots, similar to pulsing arteries, now extended through the adjacent soil, seeping into the subsoil of the surrounding forest. Laboratory analyses of these structures resulted in inconsistent and impossible data. Samples that changed composition between collection and analysis, equipment that had unexplained failures, and, most alarmingly, 3 cases of psychotic breakdown among technicians who handled the material for prolonged periods. On January 13, 2004, the 33rd day of the cycle, the monitoring team recorded a phenomenon never before documented. For approximately 17 minutes between 2:43 and 3 in the morning, all cameras, electronic equipment, and even flashlights in the bridge area simply stopped working. When the systems came back online, sensors installed in the bridge's concrete registered a sudden spike in activity, as if the entire structure had momentarily come to life and then returned to dormancy. The next morning, the team discovered new symbols carved into the concrete, identical to those documented on Grifon's body a century earlier, and next to them, written in what later analysis would confirm was human blood, a simple and terrifying message: 33 years. The cycle continues. The portal expands. The final report of the 2003-2004 task force, now kept in a special safe at the Clifton Police Department, ends with a remark from Detective Moore that eerily echoes words written by Thornwood a century earlier. The bridge is no longer just a structure. It is an organism, a portal between dimensions. And with each 33-year cycle, the veil between the worlds becomes thinner. In the next manifestation in 2037, I fear that whatever is on the other side may finally break through. Completely. And so, may God help us all. Dr. Alexander Thornwood adjusted his thin-rimmed glasses as his cursor hovered over the Publish button. On the interface of his blog, Virginia Urban Legends, Separating Fact from Fiction. The article he had just finished methodically demystified the legend of the Bunny Bridge Man, reducing it to a series of coincidences, exaggerations, and folkloric elaborations typical of rural communities. As an associate professor of American history at the University of Virginia and an expert on regional folklore, Alex had built his academic reputation by deconstructing local myths through rigorous research and skeptical analysis. His last book, Manufactured Monsters: The Social Psychology of American Urban Legends, had been well received by the academic community precisely for its demystifying approach. And still, his finger hesitated. There was something about the legend of the bunny man that bothered him deeply, in a way that other stories never could. Since he was a child, Alex had grown up hearing watered-down versions of the story. A killer in a bunny costume who attacked couples in parked cars, an escaped psychiatric patient obsessed with rabbits, an eccentric vigilante who punished trespassers. His father, Thomas Thornwood, always changed the subject uncomfortably when the legend was mentioned. while his grandmother occasionally let slip cryptic comments about the secret that drove your great-grandfather mad. Alex had always dismissed these behaviors as simple family shame for the relative who had supposedly succumbed to madness late in life, Sheriff Martin Thornwood, whose name was rarely mentioned at family gatherings. The phone call he had received 3 days earlier, however, had shaken his academic certainties to the core. Her grandmother, Eleanor, now 92 and residing in a nursing home, had suffered a minor stroke. When he visited her, he found her in an unusually agitated state, her normally gentle eyes now wide with panic. "It's time, Alex," she had whispered, grabbing his arm with surprising strength for her frail age. "December is coming. The cycle will begin again. You need to find your great-grandfather's trunk. The truth needs to be known this time." When Alex tried to calm her, attributing her condition to post-stroke confusion, she became even more agitated. 33 years, Alex. 33 years since last time. Don't you understand? It's in our blood now. That's why your father hid everything. He thought he could protect you, but he can't. The bunny man will find a thornwood. He always does. Disturbed more by his grandmother's condition than by her apparently delusional words, Alex promised to look for that trunk, mainly to reassure her. Surprisingly, his father, after an uncomfortable phone call, admitted that there was indeed a trunk belonging to the former sheriff, stored in the attic of a rarely visited family property on the outskirts of Clifton. "I never wanted you to get involved in this, Alex," his father had said, his voice carrying a weight that Alex had never noticed before. "Some family stories are better left buried. But your grandmother, she always believed there was more to old Martin's obsession than simple madness." The trunk was exactly where his father had indicated, an old-fashioned dark wooden object with oxidized metal clasps, hidden beneath a pile of dusty blankets in the farthest corner of the attic. The key, a delicate piece of worked metal that her grandmother had given her before she fell asleep, exhausted from her fussing, fit perfectly into the lock, which gave way with an ominous click after initial resistance. The odor of old paper and dried leather escaped as Alex lifted the lid, revealing Sheriff Martin Thornwood's meticulously preserved legacy. Leather-bound journals, photographs wrapped in tissue paper, newspaper clippings arranged chronologically, and most disturbingly, detailed drawings of complex symbols that made Alex's eyes subtly hurt when he tried to focus on them for too long. 3 days and nights of uninterrupted reading followed, during which Alex barely ate or slept, consumed by an almost feverish compulsion to absorb the contents of the trunk. The sheriff's diaries detailed not only the original 1904 events involving Douglas Grifon, but also meticulous observations about the bridge in the following years, theories about the nature of the symbols, and, most significantly, predictions about a cycle of demonstrations that would occur every 33 years. Interspersed among the sheriff's notes were documents added later. Confidential police reports on the 1937 and 1970 incidents. Security camera photographs from 2003 showing the disturbing silhouette with rabbit ears. Laboratory analyses of the black veins growing on the bridge. "My God," Alex muttered to his empty apartment when he finally reached the last page of the 2003-2004 task force report, written by a detective named Moore. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. If the 33-year cycle continued, the next manifestation would begin in exactly 2 weeks, December 12th of the current year. His cell phone vibrated at that exact moment, like cosmic punctuation to his epiphany, displaying an email notification from Erica Zhang, a fellow historian who occasionally helped him with research for his blog. The message contained just one line of text followed by an image. "Alex, you need to see this. They found dead rabbits hanging from the posts near the old bridge this morning." The attached photograph showed precisely what Erica had described. 3 rabbit carcasses hanging in a triangular arrangement from a lamppost near the entrance to what was now officially called Clifton Bridge Historic Park. Although it rarely received visitors due to its remote location and sinister reputation, Alex zoomed in on the image, his heart racing wildly. The rabbits weren't just hanging, they had symbols cut into their bodies, the same arcane symbols he had spent the last 3 days studying in his great-grandfather's journals. The same symbols that had been found on the mutilated body of Douglas Grifon more than a century before. Without fully realizing what he was doing, Alex found himself gathering equipment: a powerful flashlight, a high-definition digital camera, a notebook, and the sheriff's most relevant journals. His hands shook slightly as he packed everything into a backpack. A part of his mind, the rational, academic, skeptical part, screamed that he was getting carried away by suggestion and coincidence, that there was probably a perfectly logical explanation for the dead rabbits. Perhaps some teenager who knew the local legend and decided to play a macabre prank. But a deeper, more instinctive part recognized these events for what they really were: the beginning of a new cycle, precisely as predicted by the documents he had spent the last few days studying. "This is crazy," he said to himself as he grabbed his car keys, his voice sounding strange and distant in his own ears. "I'm just checking the facts, doing proper field research. That's what historians do." But as he drove out of town toward the abandoned bridge, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the road, Alex couldn't deny the growing feeling that he was being drawn into something much bigger and more terrible than a simple urban legend. Something that had been waiting for him, specifically him, for 33 years. And most disturbing of all, a part of him, a part he barely recognized as his own, longed for this encounter, as if some ancient knowledge in his blood, in his cells, in his Thornwood genes, knew that this was his inescapable destiny. This was his legacy, more than his doctorate or his academic publications ever would be. The cycle had returned, and somehow, on some level that his conscious mind refused to fully accept, Alex always knew he would be there when it happened, not as an observer or historian, but as a crucial participant in the supernatural drama that his great-grandfather had so meticulously documented. A drama that had consumed generations of his family, and that now reached out its dark claws to draw him in as well. As I drove, the sky gradually darkened from twilight to full night, and on the distant horizon, silent lightning occasionally illuminated the clouds. No rain, no thunder, just light pulsing rhythmically, as if the sky itself were a thin membrane between dimensions and something on the other side was gently knocking, asking to enter. The moon hung partially hidden by wandering clouds, as Alex Thornwood parked his car at the abandoned entrance to what had once been called Clifton Bridge Historical Park. A faded sign, covered in graffiti and partially toppled over, warned visitors of an unstable structure and no entry. Vegetation had reclaimed much of the area, turning what had been a small parking lot into a field of weeds and bushes that scratched the side of his sedan as it inched forward. When he turned off the engine, the sudden silence felt physical, as if the air itself had become thick, resistant. Alex remained motionless for a few moments, his hand still gripping the steering wheel, fighting the irrational urge to restart the car and run as far away as possible. "I'm a historian," he muttered to himself, his voice sounding strangely muffled inside the closed vehicle. "I'm just documenting a historic site." The tremor in his hands as he gathered his backpack and flashlight betrayed the fragility of this self-delusion. Taking a deep breath, he got out of the car and was immediately struck by a sensation he had never experienced in any of the countless historic sites he had visited professionally. The oppressive impression that the place itself was aware of his presence, sizing him up. The air carried a peculiar odor, not of decay or damp as one would expect in an abandoned structure, but something more primal, like the metallic smell that precedes a great storm, mixed with something sweet and slightly nauseating that resembled blood. The path leading to the bridge was almost completely overgrown, but Alex noticed something disturbing as his beam of light swept the path ahead. The plants near the structure looked different, slightly desaturated colors, subtly distorted shapes, as if they were almost but not quite correct versions of normal species. As it approached the bridge, these anomalies became more pronounced. Trees leaned at impossible angles, their bark marked with patterns that looked unnatural. Blue-black fungi visibly pulsed on damp surfaces. Insects with slightly incorrect morphology buzzed in obsessive circular patterns. It was as if the entire area was being slowly transformed, reshaped by an intelligence with imperfect understanding of Earth's biology. The bridge finally appeared through the trees, a massive concrete structure suspended over a deep valley. Once impressive, now in an advanced state of deterioration. Parts of the parapet had collapsed, and large cracks ran across the surface. But it wasn't natural decay that had Alex freezing at the edge of the structure, his heart racing wildly. It was the fact that the cracks didn't seem random. They formed patterns, the same arcane symbols he'd studied in his great-grandfather's journals, now inscribed on the bridge itself, on a monumental scale. And there was something more, something that the photographs in the archives could not adequately capture. The dark veins that ran along these cracks pulsed with a slow, steady rhythm, like a huge heart beating in slow motion. "Impossible," whispered, his scientific instincts fighting desperately to rationalize what he saw. Some kind of bioluminescent fungus, or water reflecting moonlight through some mineral in the concrete. But even as I articulated these explanations, I knew they were comforting lies. What pulsed through those veins was not water. It was not organic in any conventional sense of the word. It was something darker than darkness, a substance that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, creating fissures not just in the concrete but in reality itself. And the pulses precisely followed the rhythm of his own heartbeat, as if the bridge was somehow synchronized with him, or trying to force him to synchronize with it. Summoning all his courage, Alex took one step toward the surface of the bridge, then another. His flashlight created dancing shadows as he slowly advanced, methodically photographing each section, each symbol, each anomaly. Part of him, the academic, rational part, was moved by pure professional instinct, thinking about future articles, about empirical evidence, about comparative analyses with historical records. But another part, growing stronger with each step, was entering an almost trance-like state, as if the symbols were speaking directly to some primal level of his consciousness, telling a story his modern mind was not equipped to fully process. It was when he reached the exact center of the bridge that everything changed. A sudden heat emanated from the concrete beneath his feet, and the black veins pulsed more intensely, glowing with a negative light that made his eyes hurt. Shining the flashlight downward, Alex saw that he was standing in the center of a complex pattern of veins that formed a perfect spiral, converging exactly where he was standing. The feeling that the place had been waiting specifically for him intensified, until it became almost unbearable. And then he heard it, a soft sound of shuffling footsteps, slowly approaching from somewhere behind him. His muscles froze, as every primal instinct in his body screamed danger. With a tremendous effort, he managed to turn around, the beam of his flashlight shaking violently as it swept the length of the bridge he had just crossed. For a moment, he saw nothing but cracked concrete and shadows. Then, his light caught movement in the periphery, something or someone quickly moving out of the beam's range. "Is anyone there?" he called, his voice echoing strangely, as if the acoustics of the area distorted the sound in impossible ways. "I'm Dr. Alexander Thornwood from the University of Virginia. I'm just doing historical research." The silence that followed was absolute. Not even insects or the wind dared to interrupt it. Then, coming from everywhere and nowhere simultaneously, a voice responded, not in sound but as an impression directly into his mind, the words tearing through his psychic defenses like claws through paper. "The ritual continues." The voice was simultaneously male and female, young and ancient, singular and multiple. As if hundreds of people were speaking in perfect unison, their consciousness merged into one composite entity. And there was something terribly familiar about her, as if Alex knew her intimately, as if she inhabited some forgotten corner of his own mind. His body reacted before his brain could fully process the horror. He spun quickly, pointing the flashlight in all directions. It was then that he saw her, just for a second, a glimpse on the periphery of his vision. A tall, impossibly thin figure, with limbs that were too long and incorrectly articulated, standing at the opposite end of the bridge. What disturbed him most was not the inhuman silhouette itself, but what protruded from the top. Two long, pointed structures like grotesque ears, silhouetted against the night sky. When he blinked involuntarily, the figure had disappeared. His academic instinct fought against the primordial terror that threatened to paralyze him. With shaking hands, he managed to lift the camera and take several photos in the direction he had seen the figure, although he already knew intuitively that nothing would appear in the images. "This isn't real," he muttered to himself, his breath forming little clouds in the suddenly chilly air. "It's just suggestion, prior knowledge influencing perception, pareidolia." As he slowly backed away, keeping the flashlight pointed forward as if the light could somehow protect him, his foot bumped into something metallic, producing a sharp sound that reverberated through the structure of the bridge. Lowering the beam of light, Alex saw an object partially buried among the debris and encroaching vegetation. An ancient hand axe, its blade corroded from decades of exposure to the elements, but still recognizable. The wooden handle, although decayed and cracked, bore meticulous carvings, the same arcane symbols that now permeated the entire area. Something deep in Alex's psyche, some ancient instinct older than language or reason, screamed at him not to touch the object, to flee immediately and never look back. But an equally powerful, almost magnetic compulsion guided his trembling hand forward. His fingers closed around the frayed hilt, and in the instant of contact, the world around him exploded into kaleidoscopic shards of fractured reality. Visions flooded his mind with shattering force, not as hallucinations or imaginations, but as memories, lived experiences that somehow belonged simultaneously to him and someone else. Douglas Grifon performing his macabre rituals under the newly built bridge. Sheriff Thornwood obsessively deciphering the symbols in his lonely office. Victims over the decades, paralyzed in terror as a nightmarish rabbit-headed figure, inscribed symbols into their skin with an axe identical to the one he now held. And something more. something beyond these human experiences. A fleeting glimpse of a vast, incomprehensible entity that existed in the spaces between realities, watching patiently, awaiting the moment when the portal would finally be complete. When the cascade of visions finally subsided, Alex found himself on his knees on the cold concrete, the axe still gripped tightly in his hand, although he had no memory of falling. A terrible and complete knowledge had settled into his mind. Not just what had happened a century before, but the purpose behind it all. The true meaning of the symbols, the nature of the 33-year cycle, the specific role the Thornwood bloodline played in the ritual, and what would happen in exactly 33 days, if the cycle were completed once again. "No," he whispered, his voice breaking. "I will not be part of this. I will not be the catalyst." But even as he spoke the words, a part of him, a part that was quickly growing stronger, knew it was already too late. The ritual had begun the moment his feet touched the bridge, the moment his eyes took in the symbols, the moment his blood, the Thornwood blood, the blood that had somehow been connected to all of this from the beginning, pulsed in sync with the dark veins of the structure, stowing the axe in his backpack with almost reverent care, a gesture that the still rational part of his mind observed with detached horror. Alex staggered back to his car. His movements were mechanical, automatic, as if his body were operating partially under the control of another intelligence. All the way back, his rearview mirror remained empty, although he repeatedly felt the presence of something following him, watching, tracking his every movement with predatory patience. Finally arriving at his apartment, Alex locked the door and collapsed into his office chair, the axe now carefully positioned on his desk like a holy relic. He studied the photographs he had taken, not surprised to find that the rabbit-eared figure had not appeared in any of them. But the black veins in the structure of the bridge were clearly visible, pulsing with a darkness that the digital camera should not have been able to capture. Exhausted beyond measure, he finally fell asleep right there, still sitting, his head falling onto the table next to the ancient axe. His dreams were populated by dancing symbols and dead rabbits hanging upside down, their empty eyes somehow still watching, still conscious. In the adjoining bathroom mirror, which Alex had left slightly ajar, her reflection slept perfectly still, except for one disturbing detail that would have horrified any observer. Her pupils, visible beneath partially closed eyelids, had subtly changed shape, no longer perfectly circular but slightly elongated vertically, like a rabbit's. The shrill sound of the phone startled Alex from a deep, disturbing sleep. For a moment, he remained disoriented, his mind struggling to process where he was, not in his bed, but slumped over the desk in his office, his face scarred from the pressure against the hard surface. Morning light filtered through the blinds, creating striped patterns that danced across the apartment's surfaces. With a groan, he reached for his cell phone, vaguely noticing that his muscles ached as if he had run a marathon. Dr. Thornwood. The voice of Erica Zhang, his fellow researcher, sounded worried. "Alex, are you okay? I've been trying to call you since last night. You never showed up for our meeting at the department, and you haven't answered any of my messages." "Meeting?" Alex frowned, his mind foggy. "What date?" He checked his watch and felt an electric shock run down his spine. It was almost noon. Somehow I had slept for almost 14 hours, completely unaware of the outside world. "To discuss your Bunnyman paper, remember? The presentation for the Regional Folklore Symposium next week?" Erica paused, her voice taking on a tone of growing concern. "Alex, are you sure you're okay? You look different." different. The word echoed in his mind as his eyes slowly swept around the apartment, registering for the first time his surroundings. The words her colleague continued to utter became a distant hum, irrelevant compared to the vision that gradually revealed itself to her waking consciousness. The walls of her apartment, previously decorated only with framed diplomas and a few family photos, were now covered in symbols. The same arcane symbols from his great-grandfather's diaries. The same ones found on Douglas Grifon's body. The same ones that pulsed in the black veins of the bridge, now meticulously reproduced on every available surface, drawn with what appeared to be charcoal, ink, pen, and, in some places, something suspiciously similar to dried blood. "Oh my God," he whispered, dropping the phone. His eyes followed the complex patterns that covered the walls, ceiling, and even the floor. Not the random scribbles of a lunatic, but a coherent mathematical system, almost algorithmic in its precision. Each symbol connected to the next, in sequences that formed a continuous text, a kind of narrative or set of instructions. And most terrifying, Alex could understand them. Not consciously, not in a way that could translate into human language, but on a deep, instinctive level, as if some newly awakened part of his brain recognized this writing as his mother tongue. Fighting a wave of nausea, he staggered to the bathroom. The mirror revealed a face he barely recognized. Deep circles marked the skin beneath his eyes, now bloodshot from burst blood vessels. But it was the change in his pupils that froze his blood. No longer perfectly circular, but distinctly oval, elongated vertically like those of a rabbit. "No," he whispered, recoiling in horror. "No, that's not possible." The rest of the day passed in a haze of controlled panic and frantic investigation. Alex photographed every inch of the walls covered in symbols, comparing them to the entries in his great-grandfather's diaries, trying desperately to find some understandable pattern, some explanation for what was happening to him. He called the university claiming illness and canceled all his classes and appointments for the week. At some point, he tried to wipe the symbols off the walls, only to find that his hand refused to perform the movement, as if some invisible force blocked his muscles whenever he tried to erase the marks. Even more disturbing were the time lapses he began to experience. Moments when he was sitting studying the symbols and suddenly he found himself in another part of the apartment with no memory of how he got there. He once came to in the kitchen, holding a butcher knife, with no idea what he intended to do with it. Another time he woke up crouched in the darkest corner of his room, murmuring words in a language he had never studied, but which flowed from his lips with the naturalness of a mother tongue. On the third day after his visit to the bridge, Alex finally understood the complete pattern. It wasn't just paranoia or fear that made him avoid contact with other people. It was an instinctive, primal knowledge. The ritual had begun, and he was now its vehicle. The symbols on its walls were not just a reproduction of those found on the bridge. They were an expansion, a continuation, a vital part of a larger ensemble that was gradually being completed. And most terrifyingly, he could clearly see that the symbols constituted a contract, an ancient agreement between dimensions, written in a language that existed before words. "A host," he murmured to the empty apartment, his voice sounding strange to his own ears. Deeper, more melodious, as if multiple vocal cords were vibrating simultaneously. Each cycle requires a host, a thornwood, blood calling to blood. The realization hit him like a physical punch. It was no coincidence that his family had been involved from the beginning. Sheriff Martin Thornwood hadn't investigated the case. By chance, he'd been drawn into it just like Alex now. The Thornwood bloodline was somehow intertwined with the ritual since its conception, an integral part of the eternal cycle. That night, the axe began to whisper. Not metaphorically, not as a psychological compulsion, but literally, soft sounds emanating from corroded metal, multiple voices speaking in unison, in a language that no linguist had ever documented, but that Alex understood perfectly. The axe told stories of other cycles, other hosts, other sacrifices, and what was to come if the ritual was completed once more. The entity waiting on the other side of the portal was not evil in the human sense of the word. Just as a hurricane is not evil, or an earthquake has no moral intent, it was simply vast, ancient, and completely indifferent to the suffering it would cause when it fully emerged into our reality. The physical transformation was advancing quickly now. His movements became increasingly angular, as if his joints had been redesigned by an intelligence with imperfect understanding of human biomechanics. His skin visibly paled by the hour, becoming almost translucent in certain areas, revealing a pattern of darkened veins that formed symbols beneath the surface. His upper incisors grew subtly, becoming more prominent, and his eyes, now completely transformed, vertical pupils into irises that had acquired an unearthly blue glow, capable of reflecting light like the eyes of a nocturnal animal. On the 7th day after his visit to the bridge, the call became irresistible. In a trance-like state, Alex picked up the axe, placed it in his backpack, and drove back to the bridge. There was no conscious decision involved. His body simply moved, guided by a will that was no longer entirely his own. Arriving at the site at dusk, he found that the black veins had grown significantly, now extending beyond the bridge structure, infiltrating the surrounding soil and running up the trunks of nearby trees like pulsating arteries of some vast alien organism. What happened in the following hours would later be remembered only in disjointed fragments, like scenes from a film watched through a distorted lens. Alex remembered hunting rabbits in the forest with a predatory efficiency that his academic staff had never demonstrated before. He remembered hanging the small bodies from trees around the bridge, arranging them in specific patterns dictated by the ancestral knowledge that now flowed freely in his mind. He remembered using the axe to inscribe symbols on the carcasses, each cut precise, ritual, meaningful. Then came the part that his mind fought desperately to block out, but that the emerging bunny man within him embraced with ritualistic glee. The car that stopped on the nearby road, the young couple exploring the area in search of excitement, believing they were merely visiting the scene of a harmless urban legend. Alex, or the thing Alex was quickly becoming, watched them from the shadows, his new eyes perfectly adapted to the almost complete darkness, his body moving soundlessly between the trees, the axe now warm in his hand, as if feverish with anticipation. When he came to completely, he was back in his apartment, bloodied and exhausted. The news the next morning would confirm his deepest fear. A young couple had disappeared near the old Clifton bridge. His car had been found abandoned, the windshield destroyed by something resembling an axe. In nearby trees, police had discovered a disturbing arrangement of dead rabbits, arranged in a pattern that officers described as ritualistic. No body was found. Alex sat motionless for hours in front of the television, his mind struggling to process the enormity of what had happened, of what he had done. Part of him wanted to scream, to cry, to turn himself in to the police immediately. But another part, growing stronger by the hour, knew this was just the beginning. The ritual required 33 days of activity, each sacrifice inscribing another fragment of the total pattern, each symbol strengthening the connection between dimensions. Dragging himself to the bathroom, he stared at his reflection in the mirror. The creature staring back could barely be called human now. His face had become a cadaverous mask, the skin so thin that the bones of his skull were clearly visible underneath. His eyes, completely transformed, shone with their own light in the dim light of the bathroom. But what was most disturbing was his expression. Not one of horror or revulsion, but one of calm acceptance, almost reverence. "I understand now," he whispered to his reflection, his voice a disturbing mix of his original timbre and something much older. "I'm not Alex controlled by Bunny Man. I'm not Bunny Man possessing Alex." A slow, terrible smile spread across his face, revealing prominent incisors. "I am the portal, the host, the vehicle. I was always destined for this from the moment I was born with Thornwood blood." His fingers, now abnormally long and articulated, traced one of the symbols on the fogged mirror. "And in 33 days, when the ritual is complete, he will come. Finally. After so many incomplete cycles, he will cross over completely." The sound that escaped his throat then was neither laughter nor crying, but something else entirely. An ancient call, an announcement that the new Bunny Man had assumed his role in the eternal cycle. In his backpack, the ancient axe pulsed, in response, like a heart beating in eager anticipation. From the bridge to his apartment, black veins grew invisibly through the ground, following him like roots seeking water, connecting him to the epicenter of the ritual, and somewhere beyond human understanding, beyond the dimensions known to science, something vast and ancient, shaped like a rabbit whose eyes held the void between the stars, began to move toward the thin membrane that separated the worlds, a membrane that weakened with every inscribed symbol, with every sacrifice offered, with every beat of Alexander Thornwood's transformed heart. Local newspaper, main headline: "Teacher missing for 3 weeks. Police investigate possible connection with local urban legend." The small conference room at the Clifton Police Department was packed beyond capacity. Journalists, officials from various jurisdictions, and representatives from the University of Virginia crowded around as Police Chief Rebecca Hayes, granddaughter of Chief Thomas Hayes, who had documented the 1970 cycle, conducted a tense briefing on the events that had turned the previously peaceful community into an epicenter of mass panic. Over the past 3 weeks, we have recorded 17 confirmed sightings of what witnesses describe as a tall figure with rabbit-like features, often carrying an axe-like object, Hayes reported, his face a professional mask that only partially concealed his own derangement. 7 people are currently missing, including Dr. Alexander Thornwood, associate professor at the University of Virginia, whose residence was found abandoned with disturbing circumstances that we cannot detail at this time for reasons of investigative integrity. What Chief Hayes omitted, consciously following protocol established by generations of officers before her, was the existence of Bunny Man's secret archive, now expanded with documents about the present cycle. He omitted the arcane symbols covering every inch of Alex's apartment walls. He omitted the words written in blood on the bathroom mirror. 33 days to complete, 33 years to wait, 33 cycles to open. And it omitted, most significantly, the photograph captured by a hunting camera installed by local hunters near the bridge, an image that now occupied a prominent place in the confidential folder. The photograph showed a figure who had been Alexander Thornwood, but who was now something fundamentally different. The infrared camera had captured with unforgiving clarity the complete transformation, The human anatomy distorted to impossible proportions. Elongated limbs ending in articulated fingers like those of spiders. The posture is erectly incorrect, as if the human body were being manipulated by an intelligence with imperfect understanding of terrestrial biomechanics. But it was the face that had made the officer who first saw the image sick. No longer recognizable as that of the missing professor, but a grotesque mask of hair-like features fused with human anatomy. Large eyes positioned laterally in the eye, skull, each vertical pupil glowing with unnatural blue luminescence. Nose expanded into a distorted version of a snout. Prominent incisors visible through lips retracted in a smile that had nothing human about it. And above the head, two long, pointed structures that were not accessories or disguise, but organic extensions growing directly from the transformed skull. While the community struggled to process events through the limited prism of conventional understanding, theories of serial killer, collective psychosis, or elaborate hoax circulated abundantly. The true nature of the transformation extended far beyond what any scientific or religious framework could adequately categorize. The black veins that had begun at the newly constructed bridge over a century ago now formed a vast and complex network, stretching underground for miles in all directions. Like roots of an alien plant, they infiltrated the community's subsoil, occasionally emerging in precise patterns, in the concrete of ancient foundations, in cracks in rural roads, in dry wells, in unexplored caves, gradually forming a gigantic symbol, visible only when viewed from an elevation that no human could ever reach. The entity that had been Alex Thornwood now moved with singular purpose through this underground and surface labyrinth, conducting his work with the precision of an artist completing an ancient masterpiece. Each missing victim served a specific purpose in the larger pattern, not just flesh and blood for sacrifice, but living coordinates in a complex, multidimensional equation. Bodies were never found because, in a sense, they never ceased to exist. They were transformed, their very anatomies reconstructed into configurations that served as temporary scaffolding for something that was gradually taking physical form in our reality. In an unknown cave beneath the original bridge, the entity conducted its most complex ritual to date. 7 victims, still alive but altered beyond rescue, were suspended upside down in a circular arrangement, their partially translucent bodies revealing the symbols that now pulse through their modified circulatory systems, as if their very veins had been rearranged to form letters of an alien alphabet. At the precise center of this human circle, the creature that had been Alex Thornwood worked meticulously with the ancient axe, each movement precisely choreographed by knowledge older than humanity itself. The axe did not cut flesh now, but reality itself. Each blow opened a microscopic fissure in the fabric that separated dimensions. Each symbol inscribed in the seemingly empty air expanded these openings, connecting them, strengthening them. Through these fissures, something watched, something so vast that only infinitesimal fragments of its consciousness could pass through the still incomplete portal. An ancient presence that existed in the empty spaces between stars, in folded dimensions beyond Euclidean understanding, in states of matter that human physics would never categorize. Something that, for the convenience of limited perception, took on a shape vaguely reminiscent of a rabbit, not out of actual resemblance, but because it was the closest symbol that human minds could process without completely collapsing. For a brief moment, a fleeting instant during the 32nd day of the ritual, something deeply buried in Alex's transformed consciousness resurfaced, a last fragment of humanity that watched in horror as his hands accomplished. This fragment then understood the complete truth. It was not the first, nor would it be the last. The Thornwood lineage had been marked from the beginning, from the moment Sheriff Martin Thornwood confronted Douglas Grifon on that fateful night. Each cycle required a host. Each host advanced the ritual a specific degree, and each Thornwood carried some atavistic fragment of receptivity to the entity's influence, a genetic predisposition perhaps, or a metaphysical mark imprinted on the bloodline's own soul. And then, with devastating clarity, Alex's fragment understood the ultimate purpose of the 33-year cycle. It was not just a ritual period, but a cosmic calendar, a countdown. Each cycle weakened the barrier between dimensions a little more. Each host inscribed another section of the complete symbol. Each sacrifice provided more energy for the gradual physical manifestation of the entity in our reality. And this current one, the cycle that was now approaching its conclusion, marked a critical transition in the process. 33rd cycle. Managed the remaining fragment of Alex, struggling to momentarily control the distorted lips of his transformed form. This is the last one. The realization hit him with devastating force. The previous cycles had been preparation, each one adding yet another component to the interdimensional portal. This would be the last cycle of preparation. The next one, in 33 years, would be the beginning of the full manifestation. But even this last spark of human consciousness was quickly overwhelmed by the dominant will that now inhabited Alex's body. The ritual continued, inexorable, each movement precise, each symbol perfect. On the 33rd day at dusk, the entity known locally as Bunnyman completed the penultimate stage of the ancient ritual. Something changed in that moment. Not a dramatic change visible to casual observers, but a fundamental alteration in the very fabric of local reality. The air around the bridge took on a different, denser quality, as if additional invisible molecules had been introduced into the standard atmospheric composition. Scientific instruments near the area began producing inconsistent readings, incompatible with the known laws of physics. Animals within miles displayed erratic behavior, birds flying in geometrically impossible patterns, insects forming complex structures that seemed to model arcane symbols, mammals exhibiting subtle but significant anatomical changes. That night, after completing the critical stage of the ritual, the creature that had been Alexander Thornwood disappeared deep into the earth, through tunnels that did not exist on official maps, taking with him the ancestral axe. The searches would continue for weeks. The headlines would gradually shrink in size. The public panic would slowly dissipate. Eventually, as had always occurred in previous cycles, the community would find ways to rationalize and then forget. A psychological adaptation necessary to continue existence in a world that contained incomprehensible horrors just beneath the surface of consensual reality. The bridge would remain, now completely abandoned, the black veins in its concrete pulsing imperceptibly to casual observers, but forming a recognizable pattern to those who knew what to look for. A calendar, marking time not in days or years, but in cycles of 33. And although the surveillance apparatus installed by the police remained active for months, no sign of the Bunnyman would be recorded again. Only occasional light and sound anomalies that technicians attributed to equipment failures. 32. Years and 10 months later, in a secure room at the Clifton Police Department, the Bunnyman confidential file would be opened again by a new chief, following protocol established generations before. Among the documents, a series of photographs showing the evolution of the Bunnyman figure through the cycles. First, Douglas Grifon with his never-blinking eyes, then unidentified figures in the 1937 and 1970 cycles, then a missing officer in the 2003 cycle, and finally Alex Thornwood, his human form distorted beyond recognition. And attached to the last page of the file, added by an unknown hand, is a newspaper clipping dated a week after Alex's disappearance, published in an obscure local periodical and ignored by the mainstream media. Pregnant woman reports meeting with Rabbit Man near abandoned bridge. Helen Thornwood, 28, distant cousin of recently missing Professor Alexander Thornwood, reported a disturbing encounter while walking near the old Clifton Bridge. "He was just there, watching me from afar," described the woman currently in her second trimester of pregnancy. "It didn't move, it didn't try to get closer, it just watched. And although it looked like a man wearing some kind of rabbit mask, I had the strangest feeling that somehow it was Alex, or something wearing his shape." Authorities dismissed the report as a result of stress related to the recent family tragedy. What the clipping did not mention, what no one could know other than Helen herself, was the strange compulsion she had felt after the meeting. The irresistible urge to name her unborn son Martin, a name that had not previously been under consideration. Nor did he mention the dreams he had begun to have. Dreams of complex symbols dancing on the walls, of rabbits hanging upside down, and of vertical eyes watching patiently from a familiar but distorted face. The cycle continues. The bridge awaits. And somewhere in the folded dimensions between realities, something ancient in the distorted shape of a rabbit, whose eyes contain the void between the stars, moves inexorably toward the completion of a plan set in motion far more than a century ago, awaiting the moment when the last symbol will finally be inscribed and the portal will be completely opened. Because some stories never end. They just hibernate for 33 years, waiting for the next host to be born.